This lecture was originally recorded during Reasons to Believe's 2015 Bermuda Cruise Conference. If you're benefiting from these talks, we hope you'll consider supporting RTB's ministry. To make a contribution, visit reasons.org and click on the donate button.
I love being out on a boat and just seeing just how much water there is. I was talking with Dave Rogstead a few minutes ago, and he was commenting how there's basically 2 miles of water beneath us and hundreds of miles of water no matter how far you go around. You think about how much water that is, and it's just a lot of water. But I've noticed that as you go outside, it's kind of warm. And I happen to live in a place that this time of year is very warm. And so if you live out in Southern California, one thing that people love to do in Southern California when it gets hot is to find someplace cool. Some people like to go to the beach, but a lot of people will head off into the mountains. And one thing that's true about Los Angeles is that you're an hour away from anything. And so the downside of that is that you're an hour away from everything. But one neat place that you can go that a lot of people will go is if you're living in Los Angeles. It gets well up into the hundreds. It's a dry heat, but at 100 degrees, hot's hot, no matter how you slice it. And so a lot of people will go up into the San Gabriel, San Bernardino Mountains to get away from the heat. And as you go out east of Los Angeles, you'll run across Highway 38, and that starts taking you up into the mountains. And as you climb up into the mountains, you're presented with an option. You can continue on 38 and head up to Big Bear, and there's lakes up there and plenty of stuff to do. But there's this neat little excursion you can take off to the side. Right about here, you got about 3 miles to head back up in. You can go to a place called Forest Falls. And if you were to take this road, you're going to drive along the south side of this canyon that kind of narrows in and gets narrower and narrower the further you go in. And it's going to have lush green trees on each side. There's going to be a riverbed where you can see the stream that flows through off kind of on the north side. And as the further you drive in, you drive through a couple little mountain villas with little shops and a lot of real estate. They seem to always be selling cabins up there. And the further you get in, the narrower the canyon gets and the steeper the walls get. In fact, on the south side, things will rise anywhere from 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 feet up above the floor of the valley. And as you make your way up kind of towards the end of where the road goes, eventually you run into this what used to be a campground, and now it's just a picnic area. And as I understand it, most weekends this picnic area is just filled with people escaping the summer heat, trying to get away. And the destination of being up here is actually Forest Falls. Now imagine, if you will, you're up in this nice, idyllic, scenic getaway with canyons on both sides and a riverbed running through it, and the valley kind of extends further back up than what you can see, and a torrential downpour ensues. Inches of water come down in 10, 20, 30 minutes. What do you think is going to happen to this waterfall? What do you think is going to happen to the people who are around the waterfall? Actually, I don't actually have to imagine it because we were here when it happened. And I'll tell you a little bit of that story as we go through, but what I want to communicate out of that, what I want you to get and bring away from you, is that God is always at work. And as we look for how God is at work in creation, He will give us tools to go out and share His revelation, His work with those around us. And so God is always at work. And as we look for how God is at work, we will be equipped with tools to go out and share God's work in creation with those around us. So let me tell you a little bit about the story. First point about this is just it's a chance to appreciate God's power. So we were up there that day, and we had gotten up there. We were just done eating lunch, and as the rains came, it was it was a torrential downpour. This is a Midwest-type torrential downpour, which is unique because you don't get those in California very often. One thing that happened is the storm surged through these various channels and riverbeds feeding down into the stream. And this is a picture of one of the trees that the water had risen up this high and actually stripped all the bark off the trees. Now, bear in mind, to get up this high, the stream bed is about 10 feet deep, and this is 8 or 9 feet above the stream bed. And so you've got water in areas where there is no water running. You've now got water running 10, 15, and 20 feet deep. in what is going on here, not only is it stripping bark off, as we were walking around and surveying what had happened after the storm had passed and the waters had receded, there were boulders. I could walk up to these boulders and not even get my arms halfway around, and these boulders were pushed up into houses, just kind of thrown around like they were ping pong balls almost. It was just kind of startling to see that. And as I look back and think about that day, I was just stood kind of in awe of the majestic display of power that I saw in God's creation. And so that's one of those markers, one of those things that I see of where God is at work, and just remembering how powerful God is. And as I look out and survey through the rest of creation, just find these remarkable instances of God's power that I've been able to see. Another one, I wasn't personally a witness to this. Who knows where this is? Mount St. Helens. This is Mount St. Helens pre-1980. And what you've got there is, I think it was May of 1980, I may have the month wrong, but in 1980, Mount St. Helens decided to erupt. And what happened after it erupted is that the top quarter mile, or the volume of the top of the mountain, that's about half of a cubic mile in volume, was just blasted off the top of the mountain. What started out as this ended up as that. This is kind of this cool view you can get from the observatory deck. This is the pre-1980 picture, and this is what it looks like today. And it almost looks like not much happens, but if you trace out what it used to look like, it was about that high. And this is just a quarter, or like I said, about half of a cubic mile of Mount St. Helens was just blown off the top of the mountain almost instantaneously. I don't know exactly how much lava actually came out, but it's really just a fraction of a cubic mile. And then when we compare that and look around the earth and say, what else has happened? Well, it turns out that there have been enormous volcanic eruptions that happened throughout the history of the earth. In fact, one of them that happened about 250 million years ago over in Siberia. Over the course of about 1 million years, a volcanic eruption happened that released more than 1 million cubic miles of lava. Now, to give a sense of that, the Earth, or the geography of the United States is such that we have a surface area of about 4 million 4 million square miles. And so this lava eruption would cover the continental United States a quarter mile deep in lava. So this is an enormous amount of lava. And again, you compare that to Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens was a fraction of a % of lava come out. So this would be the equivalent of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Mount St. Helens eruptions happening every year for 1 million years. This had a pretty remarkable effect on the surface of the earth. One, it just put a whole bunch of lava on the surface of the earth, probably killed off a lot of animals there. But also what it did to the atmosphere and in changing the climate of the earth was responsible for about 90% of all the known species living on the surface of the earth perished during that time. And so we see, as we look into God's creation, we just see a fearsome power that God is ultimately in control of. And I tend to think, and I think a lot of people think, that, we can kind of explain this, and that gives us some sort of control or power over it. But nothing we could do could even come close to what God regularly does in His creation. I think one of the more remarkable examples I've seen of that is about over 20 years ago now, scientists were able to witness a first ever type event where another astronomical body collided with an astronomical body we could see. And so this was Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9, collided with Jupiter. And what had happened is, on a previous orbit, as it passed close to Jupiter, it was stripped out into about 26 different pieces. Those pieces ranged anywhere from about 300 yards in diameter up to about somewhere between 1 to 2 miles in diameter. And each of those pieces was stringing around, and the astronomers recognized that the next time it came around, it was going to collide with Jupiter. And so they were able to get their telescopes ready and actually see what happened with this. And as these things came in, they started to make impact with Jupiter. And here are 4 of those impacts. Now, those 4 impacts, just to give you a little bit of scale, the Earth would fit inside each one of those little holes. So So these are pretty big holes. Again, just to give you another little feel of how large this is. The largest bomb that humanity has ever detonated was called the Tsar bomb. It was detonated by the Soviet Union. Had a yield of about 50 megatons. Now, if you get about twice that size, 100 megatons, the blast is so large that it encompasses the whole depth of the atmosphere, and anything larger than that, it just vents all the energy out into space. So this is about as large a weapon as we could conceivably detonate that would actually be useful, if you can talk about nuclear weapons being useful. Imagine, if you will, we take all of the nuclear weapons of the United States, Russia, anybody who's ever developed a nuclear weapon, put those all together, detonated them simultaneously. The energy released from that explosion would be smaller than the smallest of these impacts. And these were not particularly large impacts in terms of what the Earth has actually experienced in the past. But yet these would cause pretty dramatic problems for Jupiter. But yet even when we look at the Earth, we see bigger and bigger things happen. For example, I was reading a paper not too awfully long ago about the studies that people were doing in Australia. And in Australia, there was a very large impact about 3.2 billion years ago. And as scientists were looking at this region, what they found is they were able to estimate what was the size of this impactor, what did it look like, and they realized that it was about a 30-mile asteroid or comet that impacted the Earth. And quite honestly, once you get up to about 30 miles, it doesn't matter whether it's an asteroid or comet or how fast, it's just going to cause a lot of damage. But I thought it was kind of interesting to ask the question, what sort of damage would this do? And it turns out that these sorts of events happen anywhere from once or twice in the history of the Earth. We know it's happened once, and so maybe we're about due for one. I hope not, because this is what would happen. It's going to leave a crater about 235 miles in diameter. Pretty good-sized crater. Now, just for the reference here, what we're looking at is let's now have this hit in Colorado, because Colorado is about the middle of the United States, or close enough to it. I know it's about 1,000 miles from where I live in Los Angeles. So let's have it hit in Colorado, because that's 1,000 miles away. And I'm going to be watching this from Los Angeles. And I'm going to see this thing come streaking through the atmosphere. It's going to be bright. And then it's going to hit and say, all right, it hit. Now what's going to happen? Well, after all is said and done, it's going to be 235-mile diameter crater. So most of Colorado will be a crater. But as I sit there and watch, about 30 seconds after the impact, it's going to go down below the horizon. And then after that, this big, huge fireball is going to erupt over the horizon. And it's going to appear 40 times larger than the sun. And it's going to be about 200 times hotter than the sun. And it's going to last for about 2 hours. And in that time, all the clothing around is going to ignite. The newspaper I was reading before this happened is going to burn. All the plywood in my house is going to be incinerated, and the grass and all the deciduous trees are going to burn up. In Los Angeles, 1,000 miles away, half a minute after this impact. Now, assuming I survive all of that, think, all right, we're in good shape. Everything's kind of settling out. And so I go back to reading my incinerated paper. 5.5 minutes after the impact, there's going to be a very large earthquake. Now, I will say, by the time it gets out to Los Angeles, it's not going to be nearly as big, but in places, it's going to be an 11 or a magnitude 11 earthquake. Now, a large earthquake in the U.S. is a magnitude 7. I actually had the privilege of experiencing one of those far enough away where my house didn't fall down. But it was, you know how the boat's here kind of rocking? Imagine if the boat were rocking like this for about 30 seconds. That's what it was when I was walking through my house to check on my kids to make sure it was okay. So not too far away from a 7 magnitude earthquake, big things are happening. Now, an 11 is, there's four numbers in there, so it's going to shake the earth 10,000 times more strongly, and it's going to release 100 million times the amount of energy. So going from 7 to 11 is an enormous thing. And just to give you a feel for how big that is, that if you go from 11 to about the maximum earthquake you could have, 15, anybody seen Star Wars? So you got the Death Star driving around, and it gets operative, and it goes up, and it talks to Alder, sees Alderaan there, and it unleashes this big laser beam, and it hits Alderaan, and it unleashes a magnitude 15 earthquake on Alderaan. Okay, so the 15 is about as big as you can get, because if you release that much energy, that's the gravitational binding energy of a planet, and it's going to destroy it. So this is a big earthquake that's going to happen. But fortunately, because I'm 1,000 miles away, it's actually not too bad. Things are going to rattle and shake, and some stuff's going to happen, but we've lived through bigger. But I'm thinking, all right, okay, so we've got the fireball. We're a little warm, but we're okay now. Earthquake comes through, shakes a little bit. We've seen bigger earthquakes, not too worried about that. About 11 minutes after this, you're now going to start to get the ejecta. So where this thing comes up, it blows a whole bunch of stuff up into the atmosphere. 11 minutes later, it starts to fall down. And it's just this fine dusting with occasional larger grains of rocks or stuff, but it's just going to come down. But it's going to deposit it about 10 feet deep. Yes, wow, I agree. So now we've got the fireball, which incinerates everything. We've got the earthquake, which shakes things a little bit. We've got the ejecta coming in. Finally, nothing worse could possibly happen, but you know there is because you just saw it. We wait about an hour and a half later, and the blast wave finally hits. Now, this blast wave is going to be traveling with such a pressure density that you're going to hear it at about 116 decibels. Now, your ears hurt when you hear something that's 120 decibels. And so this is going to cause some pain in your ears. It's going to be so prominent that all the wood multi-story buildings are going to collapse. If we're on the boat, it's probably going to knock the boat over. So we don't want to be out sailing at that time. All the office-type buildings are going to be severely distorted, and eventually they're going to collapse just because they're going to be structurally unsound. All the highway bridges collapse. The glass windows shatter. Cars and trucks are actually physically moved and distorted. And 90% of the trees that weren't incinerated earlier are blown down, and all of their branches and leaves are stripped off. Again, this is the sort of stuff that has happened to Earth, that God is ultimately in control of. And you look and say, what can we do? And we can do little bitty tiny bits of that. But we serve a God. We know a God who can do incredibly powerful things. You know, I was saying this earlier in one of the early times when I was giving a talk, and I talked about just seeing awesome things. And somebody commented how awesome, that just doesn't seem to quite be the right word. But when I look at this, just the power that God has is so far beyond what I can do, so far beyond what humanity can do in our best and most powerful attempts. And yet this God just almost doesn't even have to think. He's got the power to make that happen. And so we see God's work in creation when we appreciate the power that God has in creation. But also we see God's work in creation as we understand His design. And where we see design are where things are fine-tuned, where they're just right. And so as we go back to, as I was up at Forest Falls that day, we had gotten out, we'd just eaten lunch. We were sitting around and trying to think about whether we were going to go over to the falls or not. And that's when it started raining. And so there were two families, my wife and myself, another family, and each of us had 2 kids at the time. And so there was 8 of us sitting there, and we were sitting around, and I originally saw the storm blowing in, and I thought, you know what? This will pass. We'll just wait it out, and then we'll go over there. And my friend said, all right, yeah, let's do that. So we sit there and started waiting, and it started raining and raining and raining harder and harder and harder. And so we finally decided, let's get all the kids in the car. So 4 kids were in the car. I got car duty, so I'm sitting in there with the kids in the car. And I could see they're kind of visibly upset. So I was kind of reassuring them, hey, this is rain. We're going to be all right. We're not in any danger here. And the parents were outside kind of walking around trying to stay dry. And at one point they came up to me and said, hey, why don't we leave? And so I thought, all right, we'll leave then. And so we were about ready to get in, and then it never happened, and we didn't leave. And what I eventually found out is that if we had left, we would have been on the road when this happened. So this is the debris. This is actually after it had been cleaned out so that we could drive out. But this storm, 50 feet that way, had deposited dirt and rock and debris 6 to 8 feet deep on the road that had just washed out. 50 feet that way, the river had come up out of its banks and was causing all this damage. And here we were right in the middle of it, never in danger. Because God had designed, or because we were just in the right place at the right time, in the right circumstances. And so I see how God had this fine-tuning, this design about where we were, that we were around danger, but never in danger. And again, as I look out and say, where on the earth do we see things like that as we look at what's going on the earth? And we see, one, the earth started out formless and void, and we live on a lot of continents. In fact, barring today, we decided to abandon the continents, but normally we live on the continents, and that's because better than 2/3 of all the life on Earth lives on either the continents or the continental shelves. If you want to have a planet with an abundant, diverse set of life, you've got to have a lot of continents. And so when we look at where did all the continents come on, or how did the continents arrive, we see as we look back through the geological record that the Earth started out with no continents. We have about the continents now cover about 30% of the surface of the Earth. And it turns out that they didn't just all kind of show up or gradually show up over time, that there are periods where continents seem to burst onto the scene, if you will. When we look through the geological record, there are times where the continents there's continental material that was formed about 1.5 billion years ago, and 2.7 billion years ago, and 3.3 billion years ago. It all just kind of came on right in that middle time frame. And I find that interesting for two reasons. One is that when you read in Genesis 1, the earth started out formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And then on day 6 at the end, where there's these abundant landforms and life forms filling them, right about the middle of that is when God said, "Let the land appear." And when we look at the history of Earth, we see that the Earth started out without any land for quite some time, or nothing permanent at least. And then now we get up to where there's this permanent stuff, and kind of right about the middle, we see this correspondence between what science shows us when all the continents formed and when the Bible seems to indicate they formed. But even more remarkable than that is this corroboration with Scripture, is that when we look at what does it take, or what is this activity that generates the continents, it's ultimately due to plate tectonics happening. And so we ask, what is it that's necessary, or how does plate tectonics work? Well, there's one particularly significant time right in this area where there's quite a bit of continents. These continents tend to all clump up. They tend to oscillate between clumping up and dispersing and clumping up and dispersing. And one of these periods of times where they were all clumped up was about 2.5 billion years ago. And about that time, still don't understand the whole process of what's going on, but right about that time, the life forms that were there began generating a lot of oxygen that began to fill up the atmosphere. Now, there were probably organisms that generated oxygen before that, but this is when it began to fill up in the atmosphere. And as it fills up the atmosphere, oxygen is a very reactive molecule. And one of the other molecules that's floating around up in the atmosphere a lot is methane. And methane is very important because it's a very potent greenhouse gas. And earlier in Earth's history, the sun was dimmer, and so having this potent greenhouse gas would absorb more, or allow more of the heat from the sun to remain on the surface of the Earth and keep it warmer. Well, now, if all these organisms pump oxygen up into the atmosphere, and you've got methane up in the atmosphere, both of those react very well, and you react the oxygen with the methane, and you get carbon dioxide and water. While carbon dioxide and water are good greenhouse gases, they're nowhere near as effective as methane is. And so what that will do is it will plunge the Earth, or will greatly cool off the Earth. And what happens as the Earth cools off is that eventually it's going to be covered in ice. Because as it cools off, it's going to snow more. And as it snows more, there's going to be more and more ice cover, and the Earth is going to, or the surface of the Earth is going to get more and more white. Well, as everybody knows, white reflects sunlight better, correct? So not only is the Earth going to cool off, it's going to reflect more of that sunlight back out into space. And so this is one of the dangerous conditions that planets face, is these runaway greenhouse effects, where the surface of the planet would get so much ice on it that it would reflect so much sunlight that it would never again warm up. And that's what would have happened to Earth, except that there's also all these continents. And so as these continents clump up, they tend to stay there. But as they move apart, a lot of volcanic activity happens. And as that volcanic activity happens, it emits a lot of carbon dioxide. And it changes the greenhouse composition of the atmosphere and causes things to warm up. And so when this happened, Earth probably was subjected to a global ice age, where the glaciers went all the way down, if not completely covering the equatorial region, very, very close. And so it could have very easily just become a permanent ice ball. But because there's plate tectonic activity on the Earth, as the continents move apart and spread out, more greenhouse gases are put up into the atmosphere. It warms the planet up and it brings it out of this ice age. And so we see evidence where God is designing things so that the Earth is around danger, but never in danger of going extinct. Because if it had become a permanent ice ball, the life on Earth would just have basically gone extinct. Similarly, there are other things of the Earth becoming too hot. If it gets too hot, similar sorts of things happen. And so the Earth is in a situation where it's close to being in a greenhouse or an icehouse state, but God has orchestrated things so that it never actually happens. So kind of like we were 500 feet from a landslide and 500 feet from a flood, but we were never in any danger. And so we see that sort of divine design, that activity, that fine-tuning in the Earth. And it's funny because when you go and you ask the question, what is it about a planet that allows plate tectonics to happen? You need two things. One, you need a not oblong Earth, but that's a bad projection there, sorry. But you need two things. One, you need a rigid set of plates, because if they're not rigid, they're just going to deform and bend. And underneath that rigid set of plates, you need to have something that is more malleable or fluid so that those plates can move around on top of them. And it turns out on Earth that as you go deeper into the surface of the Earth, you can ask the question, how well does water dissolve into the rocks that it's around? Now, we normally think of water dissolving things, but as you go deeper in the Earth, the pressures and the temperatures get larger, and so the water actually dissolves into the rocks. Typically, the hotter things are and the more pressure, the better water absorbs or dissolves into rocks. But it turns out about 100 to 200 kilometers below the surface of the Earth, there is this odd place where the solubility of water decreases. What that means is that the water that is there, instead of being absorbed into the rocks, is going to not absorb so well, and it's going to cause things to melt more. And so above this, it's going to suck water out of what's above, which is going to make the plates more rigid, and it's going to cause this region right here to be more fluid. Exactly what you need for plate tectonics. And if that was much deeper, the plates would be too thick to move around. And if it was any more shallow, the plates would be too thin and the tectonic activity would be too violent. And so again, we see this evidence of this fine-tuning, this design that allows Earth to be habitable for 4.5 billion years. So we need to appreciate, as I look at creation, I want to appreciate God's power. I want to understand God's design. And I also need to abide in God's plan. And so as we were sitting there in the middle of this rainstorm, never in danger, there's a little bit more to that story you need to know. Because on this particular day, as I look back, I just see that God had in His plan to protect us from physical harm. Because if you look at this day, we're actually having lunch about 3:30 in the afternoon. And this was a Sunday afternoon. We had gone to church. Friends, the Silkwoods, had invited us to go up to Forest Falls that day. We had planned to go right after church got out. We were going to go. And as we got home and started doing things, we realized, oh, wait, we were supposed to take a meal to a family who was having some medical problems. And so we were going to help them out that day by providing a meal. So we had to go home and prepare the meal. We got that all prepared and went over and dropped it off at their doorstep. But that delayed us leaving by a while. And so we finally met up with the Silkwoods, and I could tell they were a little frustrated that we were delaying the time. And so we started driving the roughly hour drive up to Forest Falls. And as we got driving up Forest Falls, up 38 there, before the turnoff, their car overheated. And so they nursed it along for a little while and parked it at one of the parking lots there where they could be and not have any tickets. And so we decided that there were 8 of us. I drove a Chevy or a Ford Escort station wagon that could only sit 6 reasonably. So I got 6 of us in there and drove the 6 of us up and drove back and picked up the other 2 and made it up there. And here's another half-hour delay. And we got up there to the campground, or the picnic area, and we're driving around, and oh, lo and behold, there are no places to eat. And so we come back and make another loop, and we do that for a little while looking, and eventually we spot a table. And so we see the table, and we unload people, and I'm getting ready, and I'm about ready to drive my car down to the parking lot. And the people in the parking lot go, that's okay, or that I was that were there were 3 tables and only two parking spots. They say, just put your car behind ours. We're not going anywhere. So finally we settle down. We get out, we cook hot dogs, and we have the rest of our oatmeal. I have a daughter who was less than 1 year old, so we had our Cheerios, and you go on any good picnic and you have your Fritos, and we also had the Oreos for dinner or for dessert. And so we had our hot dog and oatmeal. Get everything all cooked up finally. And we're just getting ready to clean up on get those final stages of cleanup, and let's head over to Forest Falls. And that's when it started raining. And think about that. If any one of those other things had not happened, we would have been over at the falls when that storm came through. And this was a big storm. And I don't know exactly what would have happened, but I guarantee we wouldn't have walked out as unscathed as we were. Nothing physically happened to us that day. And so I just look and I see that for that day, God had a plan to keep us safe and protected. And I don't want to imply that God's plan is that nobody ever experiences any harm or anything bad happens or anything physically challenged. But I know that day, God had a plan to keep us safe. But I also know that God has worked through other people who, in very difficult situations. And I'll come back to that in just a second. But I want to look at how does that play out in creation? Because again, as we're looking at the earth, one of the things that Scripture is very clear is that God designed this earth not to be a waste place, but He formed it to be inhabited. And you ask the question, what is it that makes earth habitable? It's got continents. It's got liquid water. I mean, there's a whole string of things that need to happen. And when you look at what goes on to make all that happen, it's a remarkable plan that has been carried out. Even that plan of having organisms that generate a lot of oxygen, that is one of the crucial steps required to get a planet where large-bodied organisms, let alone advanced organisms like us, can survive. And that plan could have very easily sent Earth into a dangerous zone, but God had orchestrated. You could see God's plan there. And when we look at Earth, this is kind of an interesting image of Earth. So you take Earth and get rid of all the water. So the blue stuff is not water. This is just how high the Earth's elevation is. And so you can see there's a lot of continents. There's continental shelves. There's just a lot of texture there. There's a lot of structure. And if you asked me, could you draw this picture? The answer is no. This requires far more skill. There's a lot of intricacy and texture and detail that I'm just not capable of drawing. If we make that same picture of Mars, that's something I could probably draw. And I'm not a very good artist, I can tell you that much. But again, you see high and low, but there's not shorelines, there's not continental margins. It's like it's a low resolution map of the Earth. And what that's reflective of is the plate tectonics that is operating here on Earth. That's what builds up all the continents, gives the sharp relief, allows mountains to be formed up. Because all of the high structure here, these are enormous volcanoes that result because those regions never moved across Mars. And so these volcanoes are tens of miles high and hundreds of miles wide because there's just no active plate tectonics. And all you've got are these large impact basins. There's no mountains being built up. There's no valleys being carved out. That's what you see when you look at the surface of the earth. And again, that's all reflective that God had a plan to prepare a place where life could not only survive, but thrive. One of the ways He did that, I've talked about some of those impacts. That impact by that 30-kilometer or 30-mile object that happened 3.2 billion years ago, as you're reading through, you get to the bottom of the paper and it says, this impact might have started subduction in the area. For those of you who don't know what subduction, that is where these plates come along and as one of them collides, it subducts under the other and goes back in. So if you want to have plate tectonics, you got to have subduction. And so it looks like God is using these large impacts to start the tectonic process and keep it in operation. One of the things these impacts do, if you go up and you look in Canada, there is a large mine up there, and it's a little bit hard to see here, but if you look at this region here, there's this kind of greener area. This is a region about 130 miles across that, again, is another impact. That's the Sudbury Mine. It is the largest nickel-producing deposit in the world. the impact that resulted in this crater is what enriched the nickel and made it into a usable form so that we can now mine it and get rid of it. In fact, a lot of the technology, a lot of what we do every day, a lot of the stuff that allows us to be on this ship as a result of plate tectonic processes, asteroidal cometary impacts, maybe even the water that we have here on Earth is a result of these impacts. And so God is using all of these awesome, powerful, fearful things, if you will, to prepare Earth to be ready for life ultimately so that we can be here, not just so that we can enjoy a nice cruise, which is good, and I've been doing that as well, but also so that we have the technology to take His gospel and spread it throughout creation. And a lot of the tools we have, a lot of the technology we have are a result of the resources that God has provided through the 4 billion years of life that has existed here on Earth. One of those people who did not have good things happen was St. Patrick. This is a fellow who early in his life was kidnapped, taken away to a distant country, made to serve as a slave. Served as a slave for many years, got a vision and a dream that he was going to be rescued, escaped from his plantation, trekked across the island, got a ship, found a ship, made it home, finally made it home to his parents. A decade or so later, this same St. Patrick who was kidnapped received a calling to go back to those people to bring the gospel. And that is why a lot of people in Ireland have heard about the gospel, is because even though these awful, difficult, challenging things happened to St. Patrick, he chose to see how God was at work instead of focusing on the pain. Because one of the final things we have to remember is that God's plan is not that we would have a pleasant life here, but that ultimately we would be part of His kingdom. And that kingdom is not fully going to come until His work done on earth here is done. And so this creation is important, but ultimately God's plan involves bringing us into his eternal creation. As Joshua, in the book of Joshua, is getting prepared to cross the Jordan River, he instructs the 12 leaders of the tribes that are going across that God is going to bring us across the river. And as we go across, everybody needs to grab a stone. And as they got the stones, they stepped down into the Jordan split, and it became dry, and they all crossed, and they brought the stones out, and they erected a monument of these stones. And the reason for that was, as those stones were there, people would come by and ask, "What are these stones?" And it would be a standing stone so that they could point back and say, "This is where God worked. This is what God did." This is one of my standing stones. After the flood had happened, after we had realized we were going to be stuck up here tonight because that one road that came in had been covered 6 to 8 feet in boulders, we're up there and we're looking and we're saying, wow, look how God has protected us. Look at the phenomenal, awesome, fearful power just demonstrated by this storm. Look how we were never in danger, but we were around danger all the time. And as we're walking down, just looking and seeing how God provides for us, even in that night, we were supposed to go down, and there was a restaurant down at the bottom of the hill, and we were going to stay in that restaurant for the night, as were the 80 other people who were there with us, in a relatively, probably smaller than this room. And as we're walking down, I was with a rather gregarious person, and he struck up a conversation with this fellow. And the fellow, as we kind of walked and talked, he saw that we had, a 9-month or 6, 7, 8 month old, my 2-year-old son. Their kids are a little bit older. He goes, "You know what? I've got 2 extra bedrooms, and they both have king beds in them. Why don't you come sleep with us tonight?" And so we join in there, and as we get in there and kind of cleaning off, they just recently had a birthday party for their daughter. So the party's here. But this is one of those standing stones where I look back and I see God's work in my life, where I can point and say, yeah, God had a plan. God was taking care of things. God was doing majestic and awesome and powerful things. And as we look through creation, God has put those stones so that we can point to and say, hey, look what God did here. Look at the awesome power of what God orchestrates happening on the earth. Look at the awesome plan he has of how he is preparing earth to be suited for us to be here today. And you're going to hear a lot more about that in Hugh's talk tomorrow. And look at how God has fine-tuned things so that it works to accomplish his ends. And so my challenge to you as we go through the rest of the cruise and as we venture on, what are your stones? What are the standing stones that God wants you to put out as markers where people come and say, what's this about? And you say, let me tell you what God did there. And then the second part of that challenge is, what do you need to know about creation so that as people are around and they say, oh, that's awesome, you say, let me tell you what God did here. And as we do that, we'll be able to go out and share the gospel. And we'll be part of God's ultimate plan to bring humanity into his kingdom in the new creation. So let's look for those stones.
This has been a presentation of the Ministry of Reasons to Believe. To discover a wealth of resources, or if you have questions related to science and the Christian faith, please visit our website at reasons.org or call us toll-free at 855-REASONS. That's 855-732-7667.